After the first stage dropped for me, I sort of kept doing the same thing, and it took me about 8 months to get to a point where I would be, where I figured out how to do the second stage, how to sort of activate it, and then basically that's been the process for me for about the last 2 years or so, just over just over 2 years. So that first stage is more of looking for evidence of the self and sort of deconstructing the way it works. So this is looking into your sensations and thoughts and just seeing how they operate in conjunction to create that sense of self located inside the body and the mind. If you I mean, when that drops, it's a sort of a more global sense of self that you realize that there's no separate you. I believe I've read somewhere they call it unity consciousness. I think that's a good way to explain it. And that's the first sort of experience is unity consciousness. You realize that you're not a body, you're not a mind. Um, you are consciousness that is unifies all things. Um, so to make that drop is a different process to make the for me anyway, to make the second stage drop, which was more sort of tension and emotion based. So for about 8 months or so I was still looking at the self in the same way, and I did have sort of every couple of weeks or even couple of months I'd have a few separate little sort of shifts, and it was just a slightly increased sense of that unity consciousness, or that consciousness sense was increased, and there was sort of a less of a sense of a um, global sense of self. So that kept dropping away. But then when I was sort of still suffering really badly, so getting lots of anger and sadness and all that sort of stuff, reactions to everything that because it was so explosive for me, the whole first stage. I mean, I went through a stage of thinking it was all over for me, that I was fully enlightened, which is ridiculous looking back now, but that's how explosive it was. And because of that, I was just shocked that I was still suffering, because I realized that, I thought that suffering wasn't going to happen again. But it came back after a couple of weeks, and it came back worse than before. So really vicious sadness and very intense reactivity and anger, and I mean, it might have been the same, but it just was experienced so viciously because I guess the buffer was gone, that global sense of self was gone to buffer the emotions there. So the way I found the second stage was I was desperate again. I got into seeking mode, and I was just, you know just kind of the way I'm designed is that I just go for things. And I knew that I had to figure this out. I had to figure out why I was suffering still, even though I'd passed that first stage, and how to stop it from happening, or how to burn the rest of this shit away. So I was looking and trying techniques and writing and researching and everything I could possibly do. I remember posting somewhere on Facebook, talking about the situation, and someone responded sending this sort of link to a document. It was like written by a Buddhist guy, and he's just talking about the 10 fetters and all this stuff, and certain fetters and everything. And the thing I noticed about it was very direct, and it was very obvious what you needed to do. A lot of the advice I got was just so vague, and it was so lovey-dovey sort of stuff, and that sort of stuff has never appealed to me, and I've never really been drawn into it at all. But this was direct. But the thing was, is when I first started doing it, it wasn't working, and for a lot of other people as well that I connected with, it wasn't working. So there was some elements to it that just wasn't right, but I had the feeling that it was the way, because it was so direct, and he just seemed to know. Um, so I got a hold of it, and I played around with it really intensely for a while, giving myself migraines and whatever. But I eventually figured it out, and when I got it the first time I got it, I think it took about 4 or 5 hours of me just sitting. I think I was just lying on the carpet, just figuring it out. And when I figured it out, I just got this explosive sense of joy that lasted a couple of days, realizing, holy shit, I can do this. I now know what I need to do. So that's what I wanted to explain today, is the exact process I used to activate that second stage. Just be alarmed, be aware that you probably, if you've just gone through that first stage, you probably might have some sort of remnants of that stage to go through still. So keep looking in the same way as you did to get past that first stage and just burn off the remaining sense of global self. When that's done, you'll know, because that same technique won't work anymore. You'll still have your, you know, suffering emotions and all that sort of stuff. So you will still identify as a you, because you'll still be functioning as the emotional self you've always known. But there's that global sense of separation that's subtly different. When that's gone, you'll know, because the technique won't work anymore. But yeah, so essentially what causes the next stage, or what causes the issues in terms of the emotions that cause the suffering, is this certain combination of thought, consciousness, and tension in the body. So from a young age, we experience emotions. We can reproduce these emotions by thinking thoughts. Thoughts, you know, the body doesn't really know the difference between reality and thoughts in certain ways. We can replay situations that, for example, make us angry. And the way consciousness works is that it's kind of sticky when you combine it with thought. So, say a thought makes us angry, and we feel a tension or an uprising in the upper jaw or the lip. That's generally experienced as anger. If that sensation isn't allowed to sort of flow through us fully, then it can get trapped there. Consciousness or thought can sort of trap it there as though it's a memory, and that's how repression works. It's how, you know, repressed trauma works and everything. And I mean, a lot of trauma is located in the stomach. There's sort of a sadness in there that then the anger does protect the trauma. So you might have a lot of layers of anger trapped in the face as well. So the first thing you need to look at is tearing apart this thought and sensation combination. So it does seem like that the thoughts and the sensations are combined. When you're angry, you feel like the tension in your lip, that the thoughts are in there, inside the lip, or that, you know, the tension and the thoughts are combined. We need to figure out how to tear them apart, and that's what I figured out in the end with this. So the first thing you need to look at is look at any sort of the most obvious reactive emotions that you get in your daily life on a frequent basis. Usually it's anger. I mean, you know, someone cuts in front of you when you're driving, you get anger. So have a look at whatever it is. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use an example that I had, which was the first one that I got, which was someone messaged something to me on the work messaging system, and I had these thoughts of, I think, they don't like me or something like that, and it caused warmth or a tension in the upper lip. So the thoughts were, so let's say the thoughts were they don't like me, and the sensation was the tension in the upper lip. So that's the first thing you need to do, is figure out what this reactive emotion, the two aspects of it, the thoughts, what the thoughts are, whether they're words or pictures, and what the sensation is that appear combined to the thoughts. So the thing will happen, whatever the person does or says or whatever it is, you will react to it by having thoughts and a sensation at the same time. So they're the two things you need to figure out, what the thoughts are and what the sensation is. So in my example, the thoughts were, they don't like me, and the sensation was the tension in the upper lip, which you can call those two anger or irritation or whatever. So in order to tear the two apart, it's a very subtle process. It can be very sort of confusing and difficult at the start. Feel free to hit me up if you'd like some guidance or whatever. I'm happy to help you. But I'll try to explain it as best I can. So what you need to do is create a space between the thought and the sensation. So normally when you have the thought, it will feel like the sensation arises exactly at the same time as the thought. So what you need to do is think the thought and try to create a space between the thought and the sensation. The only way you've got to do this is through using your own awareness. So you'll have to think the thought repeatedly. So think the thought, watch how the sensation arises, and then try to create a space between the two. So you'll think the thought, try to create a little space in between that thought and then the sensation arising. So you'll have to do it over and over. You'll be thinking the thought and letting the sensation arise more and more. Um, but you'll have to play with it. The first one takes a long time. It did for me anyway, about 4 or 5 hours to get it. But once I got it, then it just became easier and easier every time. So think the thought, create a space, and then watch the sensation arise. Eventually, you'll create that little space. Even the tiniest microscopic space is enough. You'll see it. And then your job is to make the space larger. So try to create more of a delay between the thought and the actual sensation happening. More and more, eventually the delay just becomes so huge that the sensation doesn't arise anymore. Then you'll think the thought, and the thought will just seem like empty air, meaningless air. It'll have no sort of emotional strength to it, because you've essentially burnt off the reaction or the sensation that's attached to it. You've then officially divided them both. So that's one layer. You've got a million of these to go. It takes years, but I mean, this definitely works. I've guided a fair few people in this sort of method, and there was only one that didn't seem to get it out of a fair few. So it works for most people. It's just a bit of a doozy to get initially. So yeah, from there it will change. You'll have to adapt it as time goes on. Eventually, you'll get so good at it that you can just look at unconscious tension in the body, and it starts to burn away. You might have to sort of tense the sensation in a certain way, as well as look at it, and it starts to burn. It is a very slow process, but I mean, you only have to do it once. As time goes on, you know, after anywhere from a couple of months to a year, you start to find that you're just not as reactive anymore. Something happens, someone says something, and suddenly you can kind of choose what your response is to it, rather than, you know, just reacting in a sort of pre-programmed way. And that's your first taste of freedom from the dream of, you know, living in reaction to whatever's happening. So yeah, I think that's basically it. So just to recap that one, repeatedly think the thought, trying to create a space between the thought and the sensation consciously. If you're in the sensation or emotion, you've gone too far. You have to pull it back and then go back to just thinking the thought and trying to create a tiny little space in between the thought and the sensation occurring. Anyway, guys, hit me up if you want any sort of guidance or assistance with it, because it can be quite difficult. Cheers.